So you are a pastor in the Nazarene Church, but it's not just that you're a pastor. You're also, um, I guess you could call it an advocate for women in ministry. Um, and not just because you're a woman pastor, because there are plenty of women clergy out there. But I'm just curious, because you are an advocate for this. Was there like a certain experience or moment in your life that kind of led you to be more vocal about your support for women in ministry, rather than just saying, "Oh, well, I'm a woman in ministry and that's enough." Like, is there, you know, a particular thing that happened that motivated this uh, focus that you have?
Yeah. I think early on in my call, uh, I, if I would see other women who, had a call in their life, or who I thought had a call in their life, I would speak into that, just because I think that's what we should do as believers anyway. We
Mm,
should be, pouring into others that are around us. So, whether they were male or female, I would do that. If I saw someone that I really felt like it seems like God has his hand on you for, to set you apart in this particular an ordained ministry kind of thing. And I would speak into that. But it was usually one on one. Like I didn't really, I- you know, I wasn't banging my gavel or anything, that kind of a thing.
mm,
Um, and there is kind of, I don't know, like maybe an unspoken rule among women clergy of like, don't get on the whole women can be pastors too bandwagon, or you'll
mm.
like ostracize yourself, So, you try to play it cool, I guess. But uh, although I was not very cool, when Dr. Nina Gunter got elected general superintendent, I was, yeah, I was totally fangirling. It was really embarrassing, but and I'm like, "Oops, cat's out of the bag." So that, but w- really there were two things that happened, and so one of them was my personal experience, and most of the time, like most of the time when I would have pushback, it, you know, um, it was an individual, and so I would just try to deal with it one on one by myself, and then I started to really feel like God was calling me to take the lead. Like he was giving me vision, like for things that were bigger than an associate role. And so one of the things my husband and I had done is we'd actually started a Taekwondo ministry at our church
Hmm.
where I was on staff before. So we started this with like 6 people, and then within 6 months we were running like 70 students. But I became the chaplain for that group.
Hmm.
So like I was marrying people and doing hospital visits, and we were doing like little Bible studies, and like that became the most of these people were unchurched that were in our group, and I just became like their pastor. And so I kind of had this sense of God's preparing me to move out of this associate role and to take a lead role. And so I had a pastor. I mean, he was my senior pastor at the time, who really encouraged me on that. He's like, you have the gifts and the graces to do this, you know, pray about it, think about putting your resume out there. And so I started doing that. And I had an interview with a church in another state. I won't say the state. I will say this: that the superintendent was wonderful. He was great. He called me and he's like, "Hey, I got this church. Their pastor retired. They're looking for a younger pastor, and they're kind of like getting ready to go to a second service, kind of a thing.
Hmm.
I want to put your name in there." And I'm like, "That's awesome." So I would love to do that. And in case your listeners aren't pastors, I don't know if they know this, but like when you send somebody your resume, you don't just, it's not like in the secular world. So you have your testimony of how you came to faith. You've got your testimony of your call to ministry.
Mhm.
You write an essay on your philosophy of ministry. So you have all the stuff that you've done plus all your references, and then you send a photo of you with your family, and like kind of like a family bio, so to
Hmm.
speak. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
like it's this
It's
folder
intense. Yeah.
of stuff. Like there's a ton of stuff in it, right?
It's kind of Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Life on
Yeah,
display. That's what I was talking about. This is the kind of stuff
right?
that I was like really foreign to me. I work for a bank, so it's very
Right.
much did not have to do
So
that.
I preface that because what happened, you would think like I answered an Indeed.com job ad, or um, it-
Thank you for your
because I
consideration.
got there and it was
We
like
will be in
this whole
touch.
big like 3-day thing.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
sorry, what'd you
No,
say?
I was making a joke. Like,
Oh, okay, that's fine.
thank you for your interest. We'll be in touch. Like the
Right?
Indeed
Yeah.
job thing. Like every automatic response. I'm
Right?
sorry.
Yeah.
It's
So I get down there and it's like this 3-day. You meet with the congregation, you do meet and greet, you
Hmm.
preach on Sunday, and then you have this board interview. And it went great. Like when one of the board members owned a 2-seater fighter plane that he built, because like he worked for
Wow.
American Airlines, so he like built his own plane. So he took me in the plane, like, so we're flying over the area that I would be pastoring, kind of a thing. Like he's showing me, oh, like, okay, this area, this subdivision, and you need to know about this. Like like
Hmm.
I'm being interviewed in the sky. Like
that's amazing.
That is awesome.
it was very cool. I'm also like, I hope I don't die before this interview is over. But he said he had really good flying record with American Airlines, so I was just hoping that he was not lying. He was on the board, so I figured I was probably safe. But anyway, so we go through the whole interview on Sunday, and like it's just a great interview. Like we starting to gel, like um, and like they're just asking great questions, like follow-up questions that you would ask if you were going to bring somebody on as your pastor.
Hmm.
Um, and so my husband and I are driving home, and I'm like, man, I don't have a sense of what I'm supposed to do. But I'm like, well, I guess if they offer it to me, then I'll just, whatever, ask for a week or something and pray through it. And so then a couple hours out that we were headed home, we were about 2 hours out, and the DS calls me. He's like, I don't know how to say this. I just need to really apologize because they, like, I missed the 2/3 vote by one vote.
Hmm.
And the reason they voted me down was because they said we aren't ready for a woman pastor.
Hmm.
Like they're like, we love your preaching and we love your vision and we just think you guys are a great couple. We just don't like that you were born a woman.
Oh
Like, I
my
mean, they
god.
didn't say that, but you know what I
Oh,
mean? That
I
is
mean,
what they
yeah.
said,
what else
right?
can
That's
you
basically
how else
what
can
they
you
They
interpret
said.
say,
this? You know.
but we're just not ready for a woman pastor,
Ugh.
which is why I kind of set you up with the folder that we send them with. Like it
Mhm.
wasn't a surprise that I was coming.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I know you can call me Joe. Some people call me Joe, but it was pretty obvious from the photograph and
There was no misleading statements made at
no
any point.
misleading. I'm not Taylor, I'm
Oh boy.
no. So,
Huh.
so that it really kind of, anyway, when I came back and I was sitting with, I had a friend who was a social worker, and she and I have been having coffee every couple of weeks. She was because she was helping me navigate this. I'm ready to leave, but I don't know like how to do this kind of thing. And I just remember just crying, and I'm like, man, if I had a church, and I just kind of started laying out all this stuff. If I had a church, we'd do this. If I had a church, we'd do that. If I had a church, my board would be 50-50. If I had a church, I'd make sure that the leadership was, diverse, and like we just it's kind of like laying out all of this stuff, and a lot of it was just being poured out of, because once you've, like, we got down there and God birthed this vision in me, and now you're like, now what do you do with it? Like, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, we're sitting there driving around, and I'm going like, well, in this neighborhood over here, we could do this to reach this group, but over here we'd have to do something completely different. So like I'm putting together this whole vision and strategy of how I would reach this community, and what we would do going forward. And now what do you do? Like, you can't put it back.
Right.
And she's just like, sounds like maybe God's calling you to plant a church.
Hmm.
So, and that was kind of like, and then we actually did have district assembly right around that time, and Dr. Porter was preaching, which Jordan might not know who that is, but Ben would probably know who that is. And he preaches this sermon where he's like, well, if God gave you a choice between planting a church or spending eternity in hell, where would you plant your church? And I'm like, which, of course, everybody laughed. And I'm like, oh, that's not funny. I know where I'd plant my church. So I'm like, oh, man, now I got to do something with this. So in that process of that experience and planning the church, kind of came this like, I don't want this to keep happening. Like, this is ridiculous that it's 2010. At the time, it was 2010. And that this is a conversation we're having in a denomination that's been ordaining women since 1908. Or actually even before that in some of our parent denominations. I'm like, the fact that we're still having this conversation is ridiculous. So it kind of became that moment where I'm going to look for every opportunity that I can to change this conversation, because like, we have too much work to do to be dealing with this trivia. Like, the fact that I'm female, if we really believe that Jesus is who he says he is, if we really believe these are the last days, if we really believe he's coming again, like all that stuff we say we believe, then why would you only have half of your team on the field? Why wouldn't you have all of the team playing if this has big consequences? Like, if you really think heaven and hell are real and people are dying and they're going to perish, you should be signing more people up, not less, and benching half of the people. And so it just kind of became this, I don't care anymore what you think, because there are people out there who I'm going to reach that Ben's not going to reach, and that Jordan's not going to reach. Right. And so what, those people don't get to hear the good news of Jesus Christ because you've said, no, sorry, you can't play. You have 2 X chromosomes.
No. We're not ready for you to play yet. I'm sorry.
We're not ready for you to play yet. Oh, yeah. What? Like in 3010? I don't know. When is the right time? 2,000 years after the resurrection? I would think at some point we would be like, oh yeah, maybe we should let the other people play. But anyway.
Then we could be sexist and not really, like, oh, you just can't play here,
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So that actually
really upset me when you said that. So mad.
Yeah. That brings up an interesting question for me, because you're right. In the history of our denomination, we've always ordained women. In fact, our missions branch of our denomination, the group that focuses on missions, started off as exclusively women. Like, only the women in our denomination did international mission stuff. So I'm just curious, in your experience working with this, do you find that churches or individuals who are partial against women in ministry, do you find that it's more often than not motivated by theological reasons or more just personal prejudice? Because I know, and I'm sure you know this too, in the Church of Nazarene, we do wrestle with more fundamentalist theology influence in our churches, and fundamentalist theology does tend to lend itself against women as spiritual leaders. I don't know if that's your experience, but I'm just curious.
I suspect that a lot of it is prejudice that is supported by their theology. Like, their theology is a cover for their prejudice. But then I also think that some of it has to do with scarcity mindset, and that we some of that has to do with how we do church, especially these last, well, really since the Reformation, but I mean even before that, of how we do church, has kind of made it elitist. And so then when you get into this elitist mindset, you also, it's a natural progression to the scarcity mindset. And so the idea is there's only so many places that can be filled. And then if women are filling those places, well, now there's not a place for me. And so so it's not just enough to address the theology. We also have to address the scarcity mindset. And as Christians, scarcity mindset does not coincide with our faith.
Yeah.
I mean, we believe
True.
we serve an infinite God, right? He's infinite, all knowing, all seeing, right? And so he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He can sell a few for us, it'll be fine. And what happens is we you actually see the reverse, and you can see it in any kind of organization that has embraced this idea of um, a plentiful, my mindset,
Mm-hmm.
that the more women and the more diversity that you have, um, the more the organization will begin to expand, because what happens is like innovation,
Hmm.
um, like we really start to become innovative, and we think beyond what, instead of limiting ourselves, we think beyond. And so now all of a sudden new avenues are pushing out, and we're actually expanding the kingdom, which is actually creating more places for people. So we need to expand, not contract, and the
Hmm.
kingdom should always be expanding. Which, I mean, if we look at all of Jesus' parables, right, of the kingdom, all of his kingdom parables are about expanding, not contracting. And so I think you almost need to do both sides. You need to address the theology piece, but you also need to address the scarcity piece if you're really going to see the, those walls break down, and that those boundaries break down.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard the scarcity mindset before, but now that you explain it, like that makes a lot of sense. So thank you
Yeah,
for teaching me something new today. Um,
you
that's
could take
really
notes too.
interesting.
Yeah.
I will.
Look, I took notes. I took notes on you guys, so
Oh,
Uh-oh.
they're good notes. They're
We're
good
gonna
notes.
make the next vlog. I don't know how that's gonna go.
Oh no. What went on with these two dingbats, and they well, one dingbat and a pastor, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, uh, I'm really glad you shared that. Actually, one of the things I was going to ask you, if you're okay answering, was um, to some extent, I understand I'm splitting hairs and this is a chicken egg debate, but I guess it's something that I've been really wrestling with and trying to figure out, like, to what extent, like, what from whence do these beliefs come that are causing this kind of division? Like, not only with women in ministry, but I mean, a variety of other things. I'm not trying to get this into politics, but those kind of like, I'll just call them like ideas that like tend to be exclusive rather than inclusive. Trying to keep this really high level and really like PC, and I'm not doing a very good job, but um, here we are anyway. So for me, I've been really combating with, because I was kind of thinking where Ben was, that like it's a taught thing, right? Like we're always told in school, like, oh, ignorance is taught, racism is taught. Um, but what you said kind of actually made a little bit more sense. It kind of flew a little bit in the face of that, or at least is like, well, maybe actually that's the scarcity mindset. So I guess my question is this, like, was that an experience that led you to start kind of researching this? Is this something that you kind of heard and found? Like, do you have any resources to share with our listeners and myself, just so we can kind of read up and educate ourselves? Because like the only stuff I've been doing, hold on one second. Ben and I are reading a book for a series we're doing. This is not a shameless
That's a
plug.
great book.
Yeah, it is a good book. So, and then I'll do some other stuff on fundamentals. I sent Ben another one, but we've been doing some prep because we're going to do a series on that. And for me, like the big solution is if we could just get this bad influence out, it'll fix all of our problems. And I'm not sure that's the case now. I was skeptical of that anyway. Well, actually, no, I wasn't, because I was just in my own head. But now that you said that, now I'm like, well, that was a really pretty half done, half baked solution. So I guess my question is like, how do you address that scarcity mindset? Sorry, it took a long time to get there. How do you address the scarcity mindset? And then do you have time to answer that question? Because it's 9:08.
It's okay. It's all right. It'll be fine. Um, how do we address this scarcity mindset? I did read it, and I'm not sure where, in a couple of different leadership books. Um, and I have to go back and look at what
You're
I've
fine.
read,
Don't
but
worry about
I've
it.
heard a
Yeah.
couple different times in it, and I'm sure if you Google it, it'll show up in whatever. Read this leadership book or whatever. Um, but and it's and I think it's a sociological concept. So probably Malcolm Gladwell. Just it's usually Malcolm Gladwell's the
It's
answer.
always
Like,
talking about.
yeah, right. When it comes to that. Um, And so how do we address it? So I think, when it comes to the church, some of it does have to do with how we are teaching and how we are preaching. Um, and when we, in constantly showing people or pointing people towards moments where we don't think we have enough, and yet then God provides, and we have more than enough. I mean, we do see that really in a lot of the gospel stories, right? So we have that with the feeding of the 5,000. One person comes with a little, and then Jesus multiplies it. But you can even do it like if you start watching like research data, people who aren't even Christians, who are secularists, and they talk about uh, food distribution across the world, or other kinds of resources, like even just natural resources across the world. And we see where there's one group that's hoarding and another group that's not, AKA toilet paper, right? There's more than enough to go around. And then, but we have, a group of people who have this scarcity mindset. So I have to keep it all for myself or I won't have enough.
Mm.
Um, and I just, all these parables with Jesus, the guy who builds bigger barns, right? Because I've got all this stuff, so I better build some bigger barns. And then Jesus is like, well, tonight your life will be, you're gonna die tonight. So so much for all that extra grain that you built all those barns for. So we do see it time and time again, and I think we need to maybe lean on those a little bit more.
Hmm.
I think we shy away from. Um, or maybe we just teach them. I don't want to say, that we teach them wrong. I think we teach them inconsistently,
Hmm.
or incompletely. Like we teach one aspect or one side of those stories in the Gospels, and we don't look at the sociological implications of what Jesus does.
Hmm.
There's a place in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, where Jesus says, "Unless your holiness exceeds that of the Pharisees, your righteousness needs to exceed that of the Pharisees." And the Pharisees kept all the rules, um, but it was maintaining the status quo. And really, if you read through those chapters there, Jesus is asking us to rise above, so that the way that we live actually begins to break down social constructs that are unjust.
Hmm.
And so if we start, like, our righteousness should cause us to live in such a way in this world that we actually start changing the structures around us. Like that's when people really get set free. Like we get set free from sin, right? We know that. But we also get set free to do good works. And some of those good works are changing the social constructs, um, including the scarcity mindset. So yeah, I think we teach the gospels incompletely because we only look at the sin aspect, and we don't look at, like, it shouldn't just change us, it should change everything around us, and it should start influencing the structures around us as well.
Hmm.
That makes sense.
No, it
Yeah,
makes
that makes
great
sense.
sense.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
literally been wrestling with that idea for like 2 months now, so it's good. Actually, since Ben and I did a pod on how to read the Bible, and we talked about like basic views of Scripture, and like the church Nazarene stance, the plenary view, everything. It's perfect in all ways to salvation and pertaining to salvation. While we were doing that, I was reading up on some Scripture, and do you guys read a lot of? Are you familiar with Wolfhart Pannenberg?
I've not
Which is
heard
the
of
most
him.
pretentious name ever, but I love it. Um,
I got
A little
you have
bit.
to
Yeah.
he doesn't write a lot. Well, he actually I don't know much of his stuff has been translated to English. I just happen to get a hold of it through my stuff from All That, and then through some apologists that I like. For me, I'm a big evidence guy. I tend to be pretty analytical. So one thing I always have been frustrated and feel short the Church Nazarene didn't do very well was talk about how it's important now. As Pannenberg plays into this as I'm studying this plenary view, is that he's talking about this like the biblical text as a historical document. So not like a fundamentalist truth proposition, like common sense stuff, but like, no, this is a viable historical document. And so what he's saying is essentially that God has broken into like our history because he's always been a part of it anyway, right? This is
right.
his world. And so when I was just thinking about how we like so poorly articulate that in the Church of the Nazarene, like even the way we talk about like scripture itself, like, well, it's just perfect and always pertaining to salvation. And it's a great way to just to like get off the hook for not talking about like the origin of the text and all like the higher criticisms that they were probably afraid of dealing with at the time, which
Right.
makes sense for the time when that was written. But I guess what I'm saying is that like I just am really frustrated with those kind of views that aren't bold, if that makes sense. And I think that our spirituality and our the way we live out our faith, and what you said was really powerful to me, was that like we need to be a bit more bold, and we need to be okay having tough conversations, and not only doing
Right.
like doing things that traditionally like we've shied away from as evangelicals. I think that is probably where the church needs to go if it has a chance to survive in the States. And by survive, I mean like not shrink itself to irrelevancy with my generation and the generation after mine. I don't know if that
Right.
makes sense to you, but I don't know. I just was really glad you shared that, because that's been something that I've been wrestling with for a long time. Sorry, Ben. I know you probably haven't. I haven't talked to you about that, so you can process all that right now.
No, you're good.
um, but I think it's good, and I think we need to have more conversations and say those things. So I don't know. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
good stuff. I like what you're doing, JoAnn.
No, it's
I
true.
wish
Thanks.
Yeah.
I wish your ministry was in Colorado.
I like Colorado.
But like, so you're talking about um the oh geesh, I already lost it. The scarcity mentality,
Yeah.
scarcity mindset. Um, of course, you talked about it in terms of people being afraid that, well, if women take over these positions and there's less positions for everybody else, so obviously men, so we can't have that. But integrating that into like the fact that we do tend to limit how we interpret certain passages of the Bible, and it's almost like well, this passage means this, and there's no other way to interpret it. And I've had conversations with pastors who, after I preached, if I was visiting a church, they pulled me aside and they're like, yeah, that's not what that passage is talking about. You can't preach that. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, that's a totally legitimate way to handle that. And it wasn't even my idea. I heard it from somebody else who was a respected person. Anyways, I wonder if sometimes that scarcity mentality plays into how we interpret the Bible, where we think that no, like this has to be the only interpretation, and we sort of shove out other perspectives that could really help us better understand, maybe not necessarily what the text is trying to say, but how that text can be applied in various situations and what it can reveal to us that we might otherwise miss. Like your example of the guy with the barn, that parable is really good. I never really thought about it that way, of being um, more of like a scarcity mentality, but that's like a very fascinating interpretation. Does that sound too outlandish? I mean, I don't know. Do we practice scarcity mentality in our theology a little bit?
Oh, I think so. I'd go there. I'd go there.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we do.
Do we practice it in our understanding of, I mean, because I know a while back, uh when I first heard about things like black liberation theology, or I think it was also women's liberation theology, those are just a couple of them. I heard about those a long time ago, and I was pretty curious about those, like, oh, that's really interesting. But I know that they got some pushback from people, and now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like sometimes these developing conversations, a lot of times, if they revolve around politics, but if they're interpreting scripture and working with the Bible, um, maybe we do practice that. And we're like, no, that can't be the view because this is the idea. And we can't detract from that. So we can't have these other
Right.
opinions because they're sort of by default wrong, because there's just no room for those. The text just won't allow it.
Well, it's this fearful tribalism, man.
Yeah.
Like, all right, so this is gonna get off the rails, but like, I agree with you, Ben. But hopefully, this doesn't get terribly far off the rails. So I was reading up some stuff recently. Just I'll just say it. I was reading stuff about like the current GOP and like what it is after the 2016 election through 2020 and the loss, and like where it's going and like how the party's divided. Because I was just really fascinated by this whole thing. But it was also talking about how the Democrats, how they're divided too, between like a progressive wing and a more traditional wing. Anyway, neither here nor there. But the whole point is that like one of the things they pointed to was this like tribalist mindset. So now you have these like conservatives who are even during the Obama years, like letting these like people in that were like saying fairly heinous racist things in the GOP. And they were like, well, we can live with that because it kind of accomplishes our goal. Now, that's a little different than what we're talking about. What I'm saying is, like, I think we do a bad job of saying things like when we hear in our youth groups. So, like, as a youth group student, like, I don't think women should be in ministry or something. Like, I think that we need to be like, no, no, no. This church does believe that, and that's an okay thing to teach here. And if you don't believe that, we want to challenge you on that right here and now, because otherwise you end up with some really weird bedfellows, and you end up with this kind of problem that we have now, that we kind of just we create our own echo chamber for, like, I don't know, social convenience or fear of disrupting the status quo, or some kind of, like, maybe it even reinforces itself, some kind of pseudo, I refuse to, like, I don't want to kick you out of the church or push you away by challenging your belief system, but maybe that's kind of the whole point of this. It's like, be transformed by the renewing of your minds. I know that's a terrible interpretation of Paul, but you get the general point, right?
Right.
Maybe that's like part of it,
we,
though.
we have room for interpretations, JoAnn. It's not scarcity. We
I
have
mean, we
room for
could,
those
yeah.
interpretations.
Hey, thanks, man. I always get fearful of, like, quoting any scripture without, like, legitimately exegeting it first, because then I'm just like, did I look at the Greek? Did I just, like, totally butcher that? And then you weren't here, JoAnn, but we were in the pre-show. Ben and I were chatting. We were talking about Paul, and, like, we made a joke that, like, people interpreting Paul is the cause of almost every heresy in the church,
Right.
and, like, misinterpreting Paul. So now I'm, like, super, like, should I even quote this quote? But anyway, that's my whole thing, is like I think you guys are really onto something, and we're touching on something that's really important. Like, and I think we've been afraid because it feels political, but it's not. Like, this is social, and, like, there is some interplay between all this stuff, and that's an okay thing to do. We just got to live with it. We can't just, like, compartmentalize it forever. Otherwise, we're going to keep doing the same things, and it's obviously not working anymore. And I think people are hungry for different things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
They're hungry for
my own
truth.
thought about Paul is that and I don't know why it's kind of a fascination with evangelicals, but we like to interpret Jesus through Paul instead of the other way
I
around.
know.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think that all the time. It is insane.
Yeah. And you don't see that with some of the other, like, mainline, um, but I don't know. I don't know what the fascination is, but they have kind of made Paul an idol a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I
he's
should
just
say
such a
we,
big
because
part
I
of it.
I am one, but
Yeah, I know, I know.
I
He's
have
such a
not made
big
Paul
part.
an idol, but, you know, there is a tendency for us to be like, "Oh,
Well,
Saint
Paul
Paul."
says.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what we were talking about before you hopped on. Jordan and I were saying, yeah, it's weird. It seems like a lot of the support for the idea of, oh, just a horrible way to set it up. Some of the biblical support people point to for excluding women from ministry is actually just how they interpret Paul, and then they take that idea and then they apply it to the rest of the Bible. So it's sort of
Right.
going back to that same point. Sorry you weren't here for that, but that's sort of
Sorry.
how Jordan and I started that conversation. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but you're right. Like, that is
It's
an
really funny.
error
It's really
too.
true.
Like, when people use one part of the Bible to try and interpret the rest of it.
Right.
Paul especially, which have to take a more holistic view.
Right.
Well, I think Paul's just easy to read because he's just, like, saying things like, do this. This is bad. And I think people just like simple stuff. Whereas, like, Jesus talks in allegories, and you're just
Yeah.
like, think about it.
Well, thanks again, JoAnn, for joining us for this podcast. Really interesting conversation. Looking forward to editing it and hearing it all over again. And for those listening, if you liked this, be sure to leave a like. Be sure to share and subscribe. That will really help us out. And let us know what you thought about this. Do you agree with some of what we said? Do you disagree with it? Let us know. And also let us know your ideas of what you'd like to hear us talk about. And we really enjoyed having you here to listen in. And we will see you next time.